Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. This is Sopo and Becca today. We are interviewing Gábor Scheiring, and we'd like to introduce you to Gabor. Would you please tell us who you are?
So I'm Gábor Scheiring. I'm an assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar. At the moment, I'm a visiting fellow at Harvard at the Center of European Studies here. Yeah, as an academic, I work mostly on the lived experience of economic shocks, shock therapy reforms, and things like that, both their effect on health and on their effect of people's political orientation. And in a previous life, before I became a full-time academic, I was a kind of social organizer and activist in 2000s, and also an MP in Hungary for the Green Party from 2010 to 14.
So you were an MP in Hungary?
I was an MP in Hungary, yeah.
That's so great. Becca was also an MP. Two MPs.
Great.
Now we're all researching health, yeah. Health and mortality. Um, okay, Becca, well, people know Becca, who's been a frequent co-host, but maybe you also want to introduce yourself, Becca, just to make sure everybody knows who you are.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Bek Hanasvishvili. At the moment, I'm lecturer of political economy at the Georgian American University. At the same time, I lead the master's program about industrial relation. In my previous time, I was a member of the city council and then member of the Georgian parliament. But I continued also my academic work. Now I lead a research institute, which is called Institute for Fair Economy of Georgia.
Okay. Becca, do you have the first question or do you want me to start it off?
I will start. So during our research about social consequences of privatization of Georgian healthcare system, we looked through several literature about death rate, about life expectancy, which is which has exactly to do with the topic what you covered in your publication regarding privatization, deindustrialization, but our research was focused mostly on healthcare system, privatization of and commodification of healthcare system. That's why we found a lot of similarities with our research, despite these differences that were concentrated on healthcare system more concrete way. And that's why it's very interesting. It could be some kind of good support of our research also, just to present to the public not only the healthcare side of the problem, but also this political economic side, because we did not cover, for example, broadly social determinants of health in our research, and we did not cover it broadly the industrialization problem, privatization problem, social capital problem, what was quite new for me in your research, that because you underlined also social capital as one of the factors which could determine the life expectancy, the well-being generally of population. And that's why it was really interesting for me and for Topo and for Brian, I'm sure. And but what I see in your research, it is about the existing literature. You went through the existing literature, and my question would be: do you have your own research about this topic?
Sure. So if you go to my Google Scholar, you will find several of these studies that I did on this topic, and you've probably seen this short blog piece on the political economy of the post-socialist mortality crisis, which was kind of a summary for a broader audience. But this is growing out of my PhD research, which I did at Cambridge University in the UK, and I've been dealing with this ever since. I mean, there are two big topics in my research. One is the collapse of democracy and kind of authoritarian capitalism in Hungary and broadly defined in Eastern Europe, and the other is mortality in Eastern Europe, and the two are really closely related. So one of these studies that I did with co-authors is on the industrialization, which has been neglected in the literature, and it's, I think, one of the most important factors. In many of these countries, the industrialization reached really dramatic levels. So like, for example, in Hungary, in less than 10 years, almost 50% of people employed in industry lost their jobs from the end of the 80s until the mid 90s. Georgia, I just checked it in my database. Georgia is also quite big when it comes to the industrialization. It's around 40% in the 90s, which is among the highest industrialization rates. So I wouldn't be surprised if there it's also a significant factor. But you know, there are studies that we did on mass privatization, and then again, Georgia followed the typical post-Soviet model of implementing rapid mass privatization especially in the second part of the 90s. So that could have been also an important factor, but it's also quite likely that these two are related. So you have more companies collapsing if you follow a very bad way of privatizing them, which rapid mass privatization would be such a bad way. So these are quantitative studies, but I also did interviews, life history interviews with surviving kind of workers in the industrialized towns in Hungary. And I learned a lot through those interviews. For example, about communities, you use the word social capital, but yeah, perhaps communities and even more broadly defined working class culture, you know, identities and meaning that people gain from industrial employment and those companies is so crucial. And this also affects people's health, both directly and these networks that they are embedded in and the kind of meanings that they derive from those networks is also what researchers call a kind of coping resource. So when you're experiencing stress, you rely on these resources to deal with those. So these are some of the studies that I did with these are mostly co-authored pieces, but they were also like central elements of my PhD. And most recently, by the way, I'm comparing Eastern Europe with the United States. So I don't know if you've been following this deaths of despair epidemic in the US. Similarly, increasing working class mortality in the United States since the end of the 90s, early 2000s, which is really dramatic. Not just drug, that's the most dramatic, but also alcohol and suicide deaths. And it's basically completely mirroring the post-socialist story. And what I'm trying to do is to see the commonalities and foreground the commonalities. And, you know, it's so interesting. Americans always compare the US to Western Europe, but they don't realize how much closer it is to Eastern Europe in many ways, certainly when it comes to the industrialization, economic shocks and health. And just another part of my research is on how some of these processes feed into populism. Like, for example, one of the papers that I'm working on at the moment is I found robust evidence showing that not just the industrialization in the 90s, but also increasing mortality in Hungarian towns in the 90s fueled the collapse of the Hungarian left by the end of the 2000s. So, you know, when Mr. Illiberalism, Viktor Orbán, was elected in 2010, that was mostly driven by a parallel process of the collapse of the Hungarian Socialist Party between 2006 and 10. So understanding how the Socialist Party collapsed is crucial. And the Socialist Party collapsed in towns that deindustrialized in the 90s, and so massive increase in mortality in the 90s. So the Socialist Party was concentrating on basically the winners of the transition, living in big metropolitan towns and leaving behind people mentally and physically suffering. And that's fueling illiberalism in not just in Hungary, there's evidence for that in other countries as well. So yeah, so in a nutshell, so to speak, that's what my research is on related to this topic.
So before we dive into like some of the things you have found through this research, we also would like to share some of the research methodology that you're using. And also I think you do kind of survey of different kind of research methodologies. Because for our listeners, so some people may be, you know, searching for ways to, you know, research this. And it would be also interesting how to do this in Georgia, you know, how to be able to look at mortality and deindustrialization. So maybe you can offer some ideas about sort of best practices and best research methods as well. And what are some of the ways that people are tracking? Because I know a lot of times it'll be like, oh, this is actually incorrect to track it this way because people are always trying to minimize the transition. Well, not people, there's certain ruling class that keeps trying to minimize the transition. So maybe you can give us some pointers.
How to measure this? Sure. So I think combining different approaches is the best. So I did both quite a few quantitative studies, and they are powerful for many reasons. But I think we can learn a lot from just going there and interviewing people. And still you will find people who were alive in the 80s and were working in the 80s and were working in the 90s and can compare their kind of experiences of the whole era and tell you about how that affected their lives and how that affected their health. And that's, I think, a super valuable material, and something that we also need to just document for future researchers, but also because you mentioned elites. So there is this massive, let's say, silencing, but definitely unwillingness to listen to the kind of the voices that are coming from the working classes in the post-socialist region. And I think we need to kind of amplify those voices, and doing these live history interviews about people suffering in these areas is one way of doing it. There are great ethnographic studies already done, but not that much when it comes to, you know, health. And then there is also of course, the quantitative work. There is data that you can use cross-nationally. You know, from the WHO, there's data on different mortality rates. You can find data on employment and industrial employment from the World Bank or from other international sources, and then you can do these cross-country regressions showing significant associations. And then you can do the same, focusing on one specific country and focusing on lower levels, which I think is particularly interesting. Again, identifying different economic trajectories across different parts of a country, like how different towns experienced the industrialization and the whole post-socialist transformation era is quite insightful. So that's what we did in Hungary. So my colleague and back then supervisor Larry King, he won a big ERC, European Research Grant, to interview people. Actually, we interviewed with the help of these polling agencies, a bit more than 200,000 people. We collected kind of life history data through a method that's called retrospective cohort studies. So you can use this information on 200,000 people to reconstruct their kind of key life events. And because we interviewed not just people, but also asked them to tell about their relatives who might have died, this means you also have kind of mortality data about people who have died. And that's a very valuable source of information. Of course, that's quite challenging to pull off, and it requires resources. The UN does this kind of retrospective cohort studies in like developing countries where there's no good vital registry system, so you can get access to high quality mortality information. But when you do this, then it has an advantage that, you know, when you go to the mortality registry, you find information about whether people died or not. But in most cases in Europe, it's very hard to find information on things such as like people's education or other facts like whether they were drinking or smoking, that are also relevant factors that we need to control for. And when you do these individual level interviews, then you can also have those kinds of data, and then you can nest these interviewees into towns that experience different economic trajectories. So for example, in Russia, we analyzed whether individuals living in towns that were rapidly mass privatized had a higher mortality, and they did indeed. We did the same for Hungary, showing that towns that deindustrialized rapidly, people had significantly higher mortality rates. By the way, also in Hungary, we also showed that on the long run, women tend to suffer more from privatization. So there's this very interesting gendered effect on the long run. So maybe men have kind of more chances to kind of grab the opportunities emerging in the long run from capitalism. But women who stayed employed in state-owned companies appear to have experienced less stress, which I think makes sense also from the kind of the qualitative interviews that we did, because many of these women were talking about how these companies offered social services from kindergartens to like holiday. You know, they help people build their houses or obtain some form of social housing, culture services, sports services, all these services that contributed to kind of reducing stress or contributed to social reproduction and revitalization. When you deindustrialize and take away those services, many of these services are related to care work, which then falls onto women. So that's, I think, one of the main reasons why in the long run, these processes contributed to health problems among women. And finally, one of the studies that I did is on fertility rates. And throughout post-socialist Eastern Europe, there is a robust association between privatization and declining fertility for the very same reasons. You take away these services, you increase precarity, you increase the kind of just the sheer unpredictability of the labor market that comes with privatization, then families will think twice whether they want to have children. And of course, women are working twice as much. You know, when men, for example, are dying or become ill, who is taking care of them? Women stay home and take care and do this kind of care work. So that also means less time for willingness to raise children, basically.
I would like to ask you something regarding the data, because when we made the research, we had interviews almost all of former minister of healthcare and the experts and so on, and all of them, if we are frank, are supportive to the privatization of healthcare, or have been supportive to the privatization of healthcare. But our research shows that during the Soviet Union, even life expectancy and death rates was much favorable for Georgian population as it is now. But their response to this reality was that, for example, they told us that in the Soviet Union, the data have been rigged. And that's why if in Soviet Union, the data have been rigged, we see that in the different countries, which have been not the part of Soviet Union, but maybe the part of Oslo, the data are fine, okay, and that's why we can consider that their response is wrong because they just try to justify their wrong reforms and not only reforms in the healthcare but general political economic reforms with this approach that not the situation have been worsened in Georgia, but the data have been rigged during Soviet Union. What do you think? Do you have the reliable data in Hungary, in Czech Republic, in Poland?
Yes, and two things. First, when it comes to data on health and mortality and this kind of harder demographic data, not just the East Central European, but overall the ex-socialist, including the former Soviet registries, were very, very high quality. And public health scholars have spent considerable energy figuring out whether mortality, fertility, and this general demographic data is of high quality from before the transition. And the overall consensus is, yes, that this data is good quality, reliable data. So when it comes to health and population data, it's just not true that those data have been falsified. It's simply not true. And as again, high quality international research on this shows that this is the case. Now, the situation with the economic data is a bit more tricky, and that's harder to get. But I don't know if you, for example, are familiar with this book, Taking Stock of Shock. I think you mentioned you interviewed Kristen Godze. I just met her a couple of days ago. I was at UPenn. I gave a talk exactly on this comparative research on deaths of despair in Eastern Europe and Hungary and the US. And you know, in that book, they go through this debate about whether the GDP statistics for the 80s, whether it's reliable or not. And these neoliberal economists like to say that they're not reliable, and basically the crisis in the 90s is just a mirage because everything was just much shittier in the 80s than these countries were showing. But again, I think it's pretty convincing what they are like reviewing the existing evidence on this, and they show that either that data is completely fine, or if it's not fine, the difference is not really significant, and it does not affect in any way the trends that we see in the 90s with regard to collapse of GDP, decline in household consumption, massive decline in employment, really dramatic deindustrialization, massive decline in real wages across the region, depopulation, all these hard indicators of physical suffering. So there's just no way to explain that away by some kind of data quality issues from the 80s.
Yeah, so one of the more interesting things is that Becca and I actually saw this in action, where there's a small town in Kakheti, in this part of Georgia, where there was an oil refinery that was actually, owned by some sort of American scam company, but they stopped paying their workers for almost 2 years. So Becca and I were working on trying to get them their wages paid. And also they lost their jobs in this process where they have been working for 30, 40 years. And so one person died, I think killed themselves. And then another person, Becca and I, went to the funeral, who was a very big activist with us trying to get these workers paid, had a heart attack and died. And so like seeing it in real life, I believe there was a third person, but I can't recall now, but seeing this in like real life, how kind of like deindustrialization, because they lost their jobs and just found out that this man was scamming all their shareholders and so on, even though the work was present before during the Soviet Union as well. So a lot of people working from the Soviet Union and then post losing their jobs was like horrific for them. And we also had a case where a metro worker, incredible person, started the union and so on, killed himself because he got a workplace injury and was unable to work, stuck at home during COVID, and killed himself. So there's like, just in our small sort of experience, we can point to people dying around us because of work-related, either losing a job or, like I said, losing lots of jobs because the whole company's a scam. And also including like, we work with I'm a healthcare union chair. So we have lots of healthcare workers, and they're the ones who were telling me continuously how much better it was during the Soviet Union. And even during transition in some places, even though they had lost money and they were working for free, there was still a different sort of sense of priorities, a different subjectivity. They didn't look at themselves as, the ones who were treating customers, it's like providers for customers or so on, a different mentality. Because even if you look at, like I'm writing about the Soviet Union healthcare, how quickly they were able to improve all social determinants and healthcare determinants. It's this constant preaching of you are the servant of the people, you should be happily smiling all the time, serving them selflessly and so on. This kind of rhetoric too now, like if you don't pay, like, you don't get paid. And also they're overworked, like horrifically overworked. I also wonder how much, like, we did actually have a nurse die during our time when we were organizing. She was also one of the people fired from this reorganization that happened. 90 people were let go. One of them had a heart attack, survived. One of the doctors who was older and was just let go. Like the guy worked there for like 30 years and just let go without even anything. Like he was just like fired. He had a heart attack, and one nurse already did have cancer, and she died right after that. And so it was like, it really, you can still see it. These waves have not ended, like it keeps going still. It's like 30 years after, and it's still kind of going.
Yeah, so I'm really sorry to hear these stories. They are really heart-wrenching in many ways, and absolutely resonate with that I found. And one of the main arguments that I'm making about in these papers is that these economic shocks, especially the kind of that's why I think deindustrialization is so important, because it's not just about you losing your job. Even if you keep your job, you need to work more. You have probably a shittier job. Precarity goes up. Hostility among workers goes up. Services that were provided previously go away. Communities collapse. Meanings that you gain from work change. Identities change. All these things that you also mentioned change. So that has a huge long-term burden. So looking at this from stress research, this is a major source of chronic stress. And if you have this repeated experience of being unable to cope with chronic stress, you're just overburdened, and you will seek for ways to like handle that pain that is causing you. And if you're lucky, then you have good coping resources and you will find a way of coping that. Trade unions help. For example, if you're a member of a trade union, you tend to be healthier and have lower chances of dying. There's again research on that. But if you don't have these coping, you don't have money, or you don't have the networks, you're not embedded in social organizations that protect you, then you either just die directly from stress, or you look for ways of kind of soothing that pain that comes from chronic stress. And in Eastern Europe, the most important way was just drinking. So that happened to a lot of people in the 90s, using alcohol to handle stress. Drug abuse skyrocketed in the 90s. I mean, it was virtually non-existent in the 80s. And then it grew by, like, I don't know, if I remember correctly, like 200% in most of these countries. So it skyrocketed. It's a complex story because their culture changed. Just generally, the opening of the borders plays an important role. And third time, like, people just also kill themselves. Like, suicides also skyrocketed in many of these countries, from the Baltics to other parts of the former Soviet Union, but also Bulgaria, Romania included. So all these death times show that, like, the severity of stress that comes from these economic dislocations is a crucial thing. And as you're saying, this is not just a short-term thing. These dislocations have long-term effects. And again, this is something that you can show with regressions. The industrialization in the 90s correlates with death rate inequalities or health inequalities until the end of the 2000s. So even when life expectancy has started to increase by the end of the 90s, 2000s, like in most countries, you have a kind of improvement in overall life expectancy, but then you have an increasing gap, health gap opening. And this gap is in part determined by what happened in the 90s, like the different experiences and people left behind in these jobs and left behind in these towns that were suffering more. Have a continued higher death rates. So yes, these are unfortunately long-term processes. We see the same in the US, by the way. Like, the industrialization happening in the 90s and 2000s has an effect on mortality in the 2010s. And that's why it's so hard to handle, because it's not just about people losing their jobs, it's about losing their communities, losing identity, losing meaning. You know, finding a new job in an Amazon warehouse compared to your previous car manufacturing company is a completely different job, different kind of stress, different kind of identity. I'm sure you talk to these people who were telling you about how proud they were of the work that they were doing earlier. Like in Hungary, for example, one of my favorite stories is about this a chocolate manufacturing plant in Eastern Hungary, in a small town called Szereg. They manufactured, like, chocolate that was very popular in those socialist times. It was also exported to quite a few other countries in the region. But then Nestle bought the plant, and kind of under a short time, it didn't close it, but reduced employment and just rationalizing production. They stopped producing chocolate and they started producing dog food. And people are really pissed off by that. Like, that this was a town that was known worldwide as a next generation, but was known kind of in many other countries as well as a town that manufactures chocolate, and now they're producing dog food. So this is just an example, to give you one example about how these things affect people's identities as well, which is again source of psychosocial stress.
I fully agree with you, but I would like to add something and ask you also some related questions to the previous development, what took place in the Eastern Europe in case of the industrialization. So now I work about paper on one paper about work as a source of social integration. Like, social integration means not just integration, but functional integration to the same time. Like, the people know their place in the society. People know how, when they retired, how their life would look like, and so on. They are integrated in the society. Their future is more or less foreseeable for them. And broadly, I understand social and functional integration in this way. And what do you mean? If we compare deindustrialization in the Soviet past and digital economy at the moment, which also destroys the mass working places, which was common in the Soviet Union or during Keynesian time in the West and so on. Could we get the same results in case of social disintegration? And because the people at the moment also do, if we look on Georgia, they are only, our structure of economy looks quite strange. You know, we have very low level of industry because in the past everything has been deindustrialized. We have quite big share employed people in the agriculture, but which creates only 8% of GDP. It's horrible, and we have big service sector, which is the technologically very low developed service sector. And most of the people are working in precarious working conditions, you know, and maybe it will, okay, but this is Georgia, it was already deindustrialized, and that's why it could, this the kind of development, what I'm talking about at the moment, could not worsen the situation in such the big way. But what do you think in the countries, which countries maintain it more or less the industry, which maintain it more or less the massive working places where the trade union are still strong and so on. This kind of development, digitalization, you know, AI, robotization of the work, does it affect in the same way like the deindustrialization affected, was, for example, post-Soviet and Eastern European countries?
Sure, it does affect. Maybe not in the same way, but it definitely does affect. And I just want to like get back to the notion of integration and disintegration. I really like it very much. I don't know if you're aware, but one of the articles that I published, the title is "Deindustrialization, Social Disintegration, and Health." So it's exactly the same kind of framework, and it's based on the qualitative interviews that we did. So I like fully get what you're saying with this kind of integration, disintegration story. So you know, what I'm mostly focusing on is in Eastern Europe is the earlier processes, like you were saying in Georgia from the very early 90s until the early 2000s. The industrialization exceeded like 40%. That's huge. And the contemporary processes with AI and robotization have sort of similar effects, even if the dynamics are a bit different. We know very little about the contemporary AI, which groups of society it affects. We know a bit more about the kind of earlier wave of robotization, and it's a bit kind of a slower process than the industrialization of Eastern Europe was in the 90s, and it doesn't affect Eastern European countries that much because by the 2000s, many of these countries had a kind of very low wage, low value added economy where introducing robots did not like represent such a huge like advantage as it did in Western Europe. So Western European countries and economies are more vulnerable, and research shows this, that it has a bigger effect in Western Europe. But I also have another paper which I haven't finished yet, but I actually looked at the health effect of robotization using European Social Survey data and data on automation, and it significantly affects people's health. And the channel that mediates it is, again, psychosocial stress. So there is this thing called the Kessler-6 scale, which measures mental distress. It's like questions whether you find life exhausting, whether you find life hopeless, and these sorts of things. And if above a certain threshold, based on these answers, people can be classified as experiencing severe distress. And that is one of the things that mediates the effect of robotization on worse health outcomes. So certainly that can have an impact. But to go even further, environmental, like kind of sustainability and climate change related industrial change might have a similar effect. So that can be also a source of economic shock. This doesn't mean, of course, that we need to like kind of stay where we are and double down on fossil fuel based industrial production. But what it means is that there needs to be much more attention paid to how this process is managed and who pays the price and who carries the burden. Like unlike when Macron introduced his tax, like what was that, the Yellow Vest movement, people protesting against these, let's say, well-intended environmental reforms in France. So how do you distribute the burden of environmental goals and industrial transformation related to those environmental goals and decarbonization? I think is hugely important again. But also, how do you manage the social distribution of the costs and risks associated with robotization and now AI is going to be crucial questions. And not just, let me add, not just for people's health and mortality, but also these things affect people's political identities and political orientation. So these things backfire politically as well. If you have two big shocks from automation, you not only have people suffering, but also your democracy will suffer because these people will like be disillusioned with democratic processes. And if there's no other political supply that could like channel that disillusionment, guess who will channel that kind of disillusionment? You will have Europe and the world full of Viktor Orbáns and the like, because those authoritarian populists can channel that kind of frustration against global liberalism. So that's a big long-term challenge arising from these processes.
When we come back to the industrialization question, can you make the comparison between Slovenia, which was more or less exceptional in case of the industrialization and privatization, and the rest of Eastern European countries, or some of them? Because I see that you are not, Slovenia looks more or less coped with the problem more or less fine relatively to another.
Yeah. So yes, certainly. I have a paper on the social basis of illiberalism in Eastern Europe, and there I presented data on the number of bankruptcies in a few East Central European countries, and Slovenia was not included, but the Czech Republic is another successful reformer that managed to kind of avoid the severe deindustrialization that countries such as Hungary or Bulgaria or Georgia experienced. And there are good reasons for that. They had much more robust industrial policies, even though they also had their own mass privatization program. They executed it in a very different way. The whole thing ended up like companies ended up owned by banks that were then owned by the state, so the state could still maintain a support line and transform these companies in the longer run, restructure them. So that's very dissimilar from the post-Soviet style of mass privatization. Same goes for Poland. Even Poland is known for its shock therapy early on, but that shock therapy was more of a monetary policy and macroeconomic shock therapy. When it comes to microeconomic shock therapy, that is privatization and trade liberalization and abandonment of industrial policy, Poland did not do that. So again, employment decline in Poland was much slower, much smaller than it was in Hungary. And the same goes for Slovenia, is one of the countries that is well known for its cautious, gradualist approach to the whole economic restructuring process. So that's one of the reasons why you don't have this kind of massive industrialization. I'm looking just quickly at my data set here, and industrial employment declined by around 15% in Georgia from the early 90s to the early 2000s. So that 15% compared to Hungary's 45 and Georgia's 40 something percent, that's quite a different story. So it's not true, simply, it's not true that it was inevitable that these former socialist countries had to deindustrialize. It's a lie that these elites are telling us, and it's just simply not true.
Yeah. So what numbers are we talking about? Like, to get this sort of sheer scale of number of deaths, maybe you can go through the research and sort of let us, let the,
perhaps we should have started with this. So if you take the average death rates of the 80s and calculate how many people should have died if those death rates, the average 80s death rates, continue until the 90s, and then you compare this kind of expected alternative 80s continued scenario to what actually happened in the 90s, you will find around 7, depending on how you estimate. If you only look at the countries where mortality increased, you will find 7.5 million excess deaths. 7.5 million excess deaths. So around 4.5 million in Russia. Ukraine is the second biggest with 1.5 million. But then also you have Romania with 280,000, Bulgaria 160,000 people. Georgia is around 36,000 people dying in excess in the 90s compared to the average death rate scenario from the 80s. Hungary is roughly a similar number of excess deaths. So that's a huge suffering. It's basically unprecedented. You don't have this in peace times. Okay, some of these countries experience war. There was war in Georgia, but it's not like on the extent. It does not explain these excess deaths. And I also excluded perhaps the most war-torn country, Bosnia, from the data set. So this 7.5 million does not include Bosnia. And just to compare, during the same time, Vietnam saved 1 million lives. China saved 1.7 million lives. Industrial employment increased while these countries reformed socialism. So it's again a completely different story. You can have socialism transformed into something else. I don't think China is a socialist economy anymore. You can have it transformed into something else without killing people in excess.
If 7 million people died under socialism, right? Like high Stalinism, which is not even close to that, gets so much attention. So there's always so much attention on the so-called communism killing people, right? Yet 7.5 million people die in transition, not even talked about, not even one conversation about it. What do you think shapes that?
I think there is a general commitment among the post-socialist reform elites to a kind of narrative that just neglects this whole suffering story. We all know how the people that implemented these reforms were very much committed to rapid economic change, and the idea was that there is only one type of capitalism that you can introduce in Eastern Europe, and it's a kind of Wild West capitalism transported or imported into Eastern Europe, so creating this kind of Wild East capitalism. where the only industrial policy that is good industrial policy is no industrial policy, where, to quote my fellow Hungarian economist, János Kornai, where the premature welfare state, which is, I think, one of the most harmful terms ever coined by an Eastern European economist, the premature welfare state is a burden that we need to kind of destroy. I mean, that was their idea. So divest from inefficient resources, divest from socialist industry, because the idea was that it's just those industries make no sense, and divest from the premature welfare state because Eastern European countries are supposedly spending too much on welfare and health and social protection. And then the idea was that this will lead to rapid economic growth. That was the ideology. Helmut Kohl said in 1990 that no one will be worse off and everyone will be better off when they started the whole economic unification. The idea was that this will be a relatively smooth process. And as soon as they started to realize that that's not the case, they started to come up with alternative explanations why this might be happening. One of the favorite explanations is, well, this is not really happening because the data is fake from the 80s. So this is just a mirage. Nobody is suffering. The economy is not collapsing. There's no economic crisis. You're just imagining this. That was one of the explanations. I don't think everybody seriously believes this anymore, but this was a serious alternative explanation. And among economists, it's still quite powerful. Just I had this dinner with Kristen Godzi and Mitchell Orenstein, and with regard to their book, they still experience this, that there is still a significant camp among economists who are still maintaining that this whole economic collapse is just an imagination. But even if these people say, well, it exists, many of them would say it was inevitable. What can we do? It was a price worth paying, these sorts of things. And there is another thing, the benefits outweigh, they say, the benefits outweigh the costs. So they would point to how life expectancy started to improve in the 2000s. Sure, life expectancy started to improve in the 2000s, still 7.5 million died in excess during the 90s. That's not something that we should just forget so easily, and people do not forget that so easily. So why do you have liberalism delegitimized throughout the post-socialist region? Why? Because of this suffering that's been not listened to by these elites. That's the simple reason. And then they are looking for alternative explanations. So that's a very dangerous game that these elites have been playing. And I think there is a slow awakening that this needs to change, but it's still, I think, I fully agree with you that we just not enough discussion about this suffering. You know, the US has experienced a 30% industrialization between 2000 and 2020, 30% over 20 years. That's a very significant one. But 30% is not 45 or 50% that you saw in many Eastern European countries, not over 20 years, but over less than 10 years or over 10 years. Now imagine what kind of nuclear attack that was on the social fabric, and there's no discussion about the effect, whereas the whole US political debate is about the industrialization and its social effect, and there are books produced about the kind of economic suffering that it created, and there's this whole debate about how the Democratic Party has left behind its people. This debate hardly exists in Eastern Europe. It exists, unfortunately, only on the fringes. There's great research done by many people, but it has not kind of penetrated the mainstream discussion, and that is still very much populated by people who are too much invested in the kind of neoliberal narrative.
We have the same explanation of the situation also in Georgia, but additionally, it's very interesting that there is some consensus among the political elite, and that that we did not, we live in the bad conditions at the moment. Still, we live still in the bad condition at the moment because we did not establish real neoliberalism in Georgia. That is also one explanation because if we look back on the discourse in Georgia, generally among some non-governmental organizations, some political elite, opposition, ruling party, and so on, we see that most discussed issue is that rule of law and corruption, and there is some consensus amongst these people that if there would be some rule of law in Georgia and no corruption, Georgia will grow and Georgia will be one of the successful countries, because every time nobody is talking about deindustrialization. I agree with you that deindustrialization was the biggest challenge what Georgia faced in the past after the collapse of Soviet Union. Also at the moment, I mentioned already how Georgia's economy looks like, the structure of Georgian economy, but nobody is mentioning deindustrialization. Everybody is pointing on these two issues. It is rule of law and it is corruption. Like if we would have the very good non-corrupt system, and if we have the rule of law, so industry will grow. Industry grow with the obstacle in Georgia. What is totally wrong, because we see that different countries like, I don't know, South Korea or Taiwan and so on, which was authoritarian, semi-authoritarian countries, which managed exactly to this time when they have been authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, to bring out the people from the poverty and deliver to them more or less the normal condition of life. And just this is very still the right-wing elites especially are pointing on maybe it is also important, of course, rule of law is important, and corruption, if you are corruption free, is also important, but it is not the main reason of poverty in Georgia, and it is not the main reason of devastating economy in Georgia.
Yeah, I fully agree. That's the lack of imagination, and it's just a very convenient way without questioning the whole shock therapy story, without questioning the way capitalism was introduced in Eastern Europe. You can point to corruption as the main cause, and that's a very prevalent research agenda and talking point in liberal circles. And I fully agree with you. It's not a good thing, but it also is just too weak of an explanation for all the social problems that we have. And some people who research corruption, they are critical of the underlying economic reforms, but very often they use this just to distract attention or detract attention away from the real big socioeconomic problems that came from the economic dislocations that we discussed previously. So that exists in Hungary, that exists in most other countries. You have this reform-minded liberal narrative emerging that recognizes that there are problems with the way post-socialism took place, and they just look at the two things. Neoliberalism has not been implemented enough, and we have too much corruption. Why do we have too much corruption? Because we have still, that's often part of the explanation, because we have still too much socialism lingering on. It's these elites that survived, and it's in certain degree it's part of the story. Like, for example, in Russia, we have a very different way of creating the new capitalist than in a country such as Hungary, which is very much a political kind of capitalism. Whereas in Hungary, you created capitalism by importing foreign capital from day one on. So Hungary was the first country that fully opened the gates towards foreign investors, but still it ended up in a huge economic crisis by the end of the 2000s. So that kind of transition model is no solution either. There is an exhaustion of the overall kind of liberal transition, and corruption is just not the full explanation of that. You know, like I just again looked at my data set and talking about foreign investment, which is very often presented as a panacea for like a magic bullet solution for the problems that these countries have. Georgia also has like around by the end of the let's say 2010, foreign direct investment penetration has reached 70% of the Georgian GDP, but industrial employment in 2010 was still 25% lower than it was in 91. So that's still 25% lower. That's almost like as much as the total deindustrialization in the US. In Germany, the industrialization over the last 20-something years was 20% altogether. So even if you double down on foreign investment and you play the neoliberal game as well as you can, you will still end up having these social problems. In fact, you can create a problem of economic dependency. That is very much a problem in many of these countries, and you can really rely on research from several decades ago from Latin America to understand the social and economic implications of that. So that's one of the things that I did in my book and some of the papers that I wrote about kind of dependent development and the exhaustion of dependent development, even in what was considered the most successful cases, such as Hungary, that contributed to social problems, economic problems, and then also the delegitimization of liberalism itself.
So I really appreciate you taking this back to like making sense politically what's happening, you know. So like the economic changes, social fabrics are coming loose, and then making case how this translates politically. And I think that's a really valid point you made, where in America it is debated endlessly, yet nothing really in the post-socialist countries. Though I do find even the debates within the US very sort of segregated, in the sense that like the Democrats never acknowledge this, that this is happening, or like whenever I discuss the industrialization and men's suicide rates, I'm like considered like a men's rights activist or something, where I'm like, no, like the men are actually killing themselves at a really high rate, you know, like, and so it's like, it's really interesting because it's like the way this sort of social interpretations also come from that, like the men that are turning towards the right or alt-right, you know, being made fun of because they're in mommy's basements, because I have like no industry and so on. It's a quick collapse of all this. But, you know, looking at politically, like world politics now, right? Like I'm looking at Georgia, I'm looking at how it's trying to emulate now the ruling party, the Hungarian kind of approach. I'm seeing how they've to some level, they've realized this sort of incredibly neoliberal approach, and liberalization has gotten sort of away from them, and this sort of attempt to bring back like an idea of protectionism in a sense, trying to emulate Hungary. And really, there's no other development models that you can spot and say, like, you don't like liberalism and liberalism destroying our country, right? Our people, to point to another example besides like Hungary, where any kind of right-wing, you know, developmental model, there's nothing else to point to. That's, I find frustrating also, you know, a socialist and to provide, right? to Georgians and say, this is actually what we can do. Now it's like either EU or Russia. That's the cultural dynamic. Absolutely using Soviet Union as part of imagery of Russia is how they're attempting to demonize it. And constantly saying things like never back to this USSR. Like that is the opposition's like the liberal main point of view. It's like they put this on everywhere. And they further, not only is it actually illegal to be communist in Georgia or have communist symbols, but also like discussions around that, it becomes even more and more taboo, right? To have like honest discussions of what's happening. It is so, it's like, I don't know, it's opening up one of the biggest taboos in the world, discussing things much better. So it makes it even more difficult to even have these conversations. So anyway, so this is like some things that like maybe you wanted to comment on. These are sort of like thinking about all this and how this relates, and also like would love to replicate some of the studies in Georgia, like because the 36,000 seems quite low compared to, or 38,000, I remember what you said, to the level of deindustrialization that I've seen, the devastation,
Yeah, just a comment on that. I don't know about the structure of the welfare state in Georgia in the 90s. Hungary, you have massive digitalization, but also had quite well-developed welfare state institutions in the early 90s. So that saved a lot of lives. So the industrialization is one factor, but then the kind of therapy through welfare state is another factor that can save lives. So that's something that we also need to take into consideration when explaining or trying to explain these patterns. But commenting on your bigger point about the lack of alternatives is something like I fully agree. You summarize the situation very well. Unfortunately, politics in Eastern Europe, but more generally, has in most countries in Europe and the US also has kind of US a bit less, but there also has kind of digressed into this dual opposition between populist nationalism versus the kind of democratic liberal center. So you have this centrist liberalism that is protecting the status quo from the 90s on, or from the 80s on even, that was built. And then you have the challengers on the right. And then as these challengers become stronger and stronger, the reaction on the kind of the liberal side is kind of this we need to protect this whatever we have. And these are not days you have a lot of innovation going on among these people. Again, I think you have much more innovation in the US with, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and investment in industry. But Europe is very, very disillusioning, I think, and Eastern Europe even more so. Like I fully agree that the only kind of strategic alternative that has emerged to this hardcore liberalism is this kind of nationalist protectionism that under Viktor Orbán, which by the way is again an argument that I make in my papers and book, is not really an alternative to neoliberalism. So it actually, Orbán doubles down on some of the worst aspects of neoliberalism, such as, for example, the flat tax. He has reduced taxation on high-income individuals. He has reduced taxation on corporations. Guess which country in the OECD has the lowest corporate tax rate? It's Hungary. He has eliminated unemployment benefits. So he's not really going against neoliberalism, but he portrays himself as if he would be going against neoliberalism. And that's very crucial because people perceive him so, because he does something that goes against some what I call peripheral aspects of the neoliberal consensus. So, for example, nationalizing the privatized pension system goes against neoliberalism, but not against the core of neoliberalism. And he plays around with these things very, very cleverly while maintaining the status quo of neoliberalism in industrial policy and doubling down on cheap labor-based exports, relying on German car manufacturing assembly plants. That's the core of his model. He's also doing this more kind of protectionist politics, mostly for the show, right? So that people that perceive him as the grand protector of the nation. And then there is no real alternative other than that. The other side is just trying to protect whatever there was and maybe tinkering with very minor reforms. So we still live in a times that was really perfectly defined. It's another famous quote that I really like to use in my presentations by Helmut Schmidt, who said, this German social democratic politician, perfectly summarizing the technocratic and neoliberal turn of center-left politics. He said, whoever has visions should go see the doctor. So you have the left that has just like basically become this, politics is not anymore about grand visions. It's not about grand ideologies. It's not about how do you address the big questions of democratic capitalism. How do you pacify the grand social conflicts between social groups? No, it's about let the right technocratic experts do their magic and then let the market take care of the rest. That's still the prevailing understanding among social democrats in Europe. I mean, look at the current German government governing together with the FDP, mired in austerity, fueling the rise of the AfD. It's just a disaster. But what is like happening in the UK? Like, is Keir Starmer planning on any major reform? He will have the biggest labor minority in several decades in that country. And what is he planning on doing? Well, nothing, basically. So that's really the kind of the lack of total imagination, and that the intellectual innovation is really happening on the alt-right or the right these days, and that's a main problem. Of course, it was there in Europe on the fringes with the populist left, but that has basically lost its momentum as of now, or has been actively killed off, like as in the UK or in Greece by liberal elites. In the US, it has had a bigger effect on, like, you can't say that Biden is continuing where the Clintons left off. It's just not true to the same extent. But even mainstream economists in the US are very often more to the left, at least in a sense of Keynesianism and interventionism and industrial policy, compared to the average austerity-obsessed mainstream European economist.
By the way, Georgia, in the sense of what Sopo and you just discussed, are quite similar to the situation, but also it's not exceptional, but it has a lot of differences. If we look on the world generally, we see that, for example, this kind of political cleavages, like between labor and capital, between ecology and capital, between church and state, between center and region and so on, are disappearing. And instead of these political cleavages, we are getting just one political cleavage. It is a globalist and it is nativist. Like, all kind of societies, despite the level of industrialization or not, at the moment, especially at the moment, in the past 10 years, are divided in these two groups. Like, okay, they have some subgroups, but these two main groups exist in all countries, like in Georgia, because I agree with Sopo that there is no alternative. Just only one visible groups are either liberals, neoliberals, or the nativists, or let's say conservatives, and so on, which are maybe ideologically, culturally, ideologically quite different from each other. Okay, but economically they are quite similar, because when I was in the parliament, when we started this, when I came in the politics, I was not a member of the ruling party, but I was a part of the ruling party, the broader coalition, and we understood ourselves as a social democrat. Even the ruling party became part of a big social democratic family of European Union and so on, associated member or something like that. But, despite this decision, the Georgian dream does not touch, the ruling party does not touch the most interesting and most, horrible legislation in flat tax, and we could not increase the taxes and so on. It is cemented in the constitution in Georgia. And the second is also introduction of pension reform. They, despite to introduce the pension reform, which will decrease the inequality in the pension age, they introduced the pension reform, which was supported the World Bank, which is based on personal savings and so on, like maybe it was in Hungary and so on. And now Georgian, this ruling party became quite conservative. They left the social democratic family and becomes a member of conservative families. But the difference is, this is a similarity with another countries on the global level. But the difference is that we even did not manage to create these political cleavages in Georgia, because it is not observable, or it is not articulated enough, these differences between capital and labor in the proper way. Like all these groups have their own representative. For example, on the political level, labor has their own representative, maybe weak, maybe strong, it does not matter. But this group has no representative at all. Capital have representative. The conservative part of society has no representative is a proper way, but the now ruling party is taking this place. But because of this nationalism, what emerged after the collapse of Soviet Union in Georgia, which was based on Russophobia and on neoliberalism, there was no place to create some political cleavages, to articulate some political cleavages, and now all the rest of the societies and the countries are getting more similar and similar in Georgia, because in these societies, also with traditional societies with a big industrial sector and so on, they are also losing this traditional political cleavage, which did not emerge in Georgia. But in these countries, there was quite clear, they have the social democratic parties, conservative parties, liberal parties, green parties, and so on. But these divisions are disappearing now in each country. And only one division is this globalist and nativist, which are represented from nationalists and which are represented from this infantile liberal.
Exactly. That's why you have Eastern Europe as the kind of laboratory for illiberalism, because the whole collapse of the left, not just as a political project, but also as a cultural project and social organizing project, predated the parallel decline of social democracy in the West. And it takes different forms. In some countries, it's the parties of the left that move to the right, but the effect is the same. You have the liberals occupying the space that kind of mobilizes the victims of globalization. This is the model in Slovakia, Smer, moving to the right. In Romania, it's also the kind of the ex-socialists occupying now the nationalist position. In Poland and Hungary, it's different. It's coming more from the right, but the effect is the same. You don't have like a progressive social democracy in these countries. It's not been there's been no effort at all to build it up in the 90s. The whole language of socialism was completely delegitimized. The whole language of class analysis as a research strategy vanished over a few years. So you have a lot of research on the rule of law and corruption, but hardly any on class cleavages and things like that. And this has an effect. Parties have not built up their kind of counter-hegemonic strategies. They have hardly any investment in political education. They have hardly any investment in, like, producing books, in producing the kind of narratives that could form people's identities. And that's why you had this emerging in Poland and in Hungary early on, this kind of illiberalism that has become, in many ways, a paradigmatic case of illiberalism for many countries in Western Europe. So it's just a stronger. Many of these former socialist countries have gone in the same direction as Western European countries, but just much more forcefully and with much more suffering and like that's why with an even stronger pushback in many cases from or counter movement from authoritarian politics. Now there's of course all kinds of differences in timing. So this takes place according to local political and cultural history. So it's not like a unified region. We're talking about a huge region, but the overall tendency, I would say, holds in many of these cases, that you have a disillusionment with liberalism and illiberalism, nationalist illiberalism emerging as the only real alternative to that.
Well, for 4 years, I had the meeting with a US ambassador, Italian, German, and French ambassadors. It was some kind of dinner or something like that. And they were talking about, division of Georgian society. How divided Georgian society is on two parts, like, former ruling party and the current ruling party. And I told them that the same will happen also in America, because it is not division just between parties, it's a division between societies. And in 2 months, the people entered the Congress, the building of Congress. It was, because it was like, they are looking on Georgia from the top, like, you're divided society, we are totally integrated society and so on, but it's bullshit. It's the same in each country.
Yeah. This is not a problem of post-socialism. This is a problem of globalized capitalism. It takes shape differently in different parts of the world, but it has similar roots. That's why you have quite similar trends in the US and in Eastern Europe.
Maybe like last thoughts you want to leave a lot of our listeners who are, maybe this is new for them, maybe a couple of like ending thoughts that we can finish on. I actually had a lot more questions, but because you're pressed for time, we will save it for another time, maybe a part 2. So maybe some last thoughts.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do a part 2. I don't know, like it can sound very depressing, the processes that we've been talking about, but in many ways the world is headed towards a very dangerous place, I'd say, with these competitive nationalisms emerging. So I have no illusions about that. But then on the other hand, things can change, and if you think about how things changed dramatically under COVID, or how Orban was able to change some fundamentals of the system in a bad way, but still change, I think we can imagine and build a better world. So I want to just conclude on a more hopeful note, even if it's not like a short-term project. I think just knowing that things can be better and there's a room for doing work that points towards a more just and sustainable future makes sense. I think that's important to remember.